right, I apologize for the interruption. We are streaming live.
Great. Martha, do you want to go with your comment?
Yes.
Go ahead. You're muted. Martha?
Okay, now do you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Even though it does cover a lot of material, but I still think it's vague. It says any employment may report conduct which is believed is sexual harassment, but then it says may clearly express, and it says the initial message may be verbal. If subsequent messages are needed, they should be put in writing in a note or memo. I think that all correspondence regarding sexual harassment should be done on a form and should be from the get-go should be on paper, because then I think that we should avoid past practice. And I think leaving it this way, that the initial message may be verbal, there's no proof of when it was reported, the date, who it was reported to, and what was done subsequently. That's my only objection to this. I don't think anything should be verbal when you're discussing or it may result in the firing or remediation of an employee.
I think that
I don't know if that's possible to change it, but I think that it should always be on paper.
I mean, respectfully, trustee, I believe that section is not referring to the reporting of the sexual harassment claim, but rather when the harassed employee feels that there is an issue, that they should express their objection to the person doing it. So what I'm trying to say is, if you have an employee who's potentially harassing another employee, it's incumbent on that employee to say something to that other employee, and they can do that initial, thing like hey, would you knock it off, before, putting something into a formal writing or formal memo to their superiors.
That's how I read it. That's Douglas, what you just said is how I interpreted that section. But I guess I'd be interested to know if other people are interpreting it as a report can be made verbally to somebody. I don't read it that way, but.
Well, and I mean, again, sort of to that extent, the actual report requires that the complaint be made in writing later on, I believe.
Martha, does that answer your comments, questions?
Not really, because it still says oral. It says maybe verbal. And I just think that with things like this that are like a serious nature, I think everything should be more just more succinct as far as when the complaint was first noticed or was first brought to the attention. I mean, I know with the teachers, we go through first, second, third, and everything has to be notated with unions and everything. And I think just setting it up to be verbal, it just leaves it too open. Sorry.
I mean, we can certainly make that change. Again, my only concern is that if an employee feels like they have to formally write an objection to their coworker for saying something to them, you're making it more difficult for employees to say stop.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Martha, are you speaking in terms of you think if two employees if this is occurring, do you mean that the harassed employee needs to write to their harasser? I thought we were talking purely in terms of management.
No, there's no correspondence between the two. They wouldn't be expected. It would be to the supervisor. And also how it says a note or a memo. I think everything should be done electronically. Maybe there should be a form where the employee fills out and sends it into a supervisor. So there's a written record of when the complaint was put in. and also all the correspondence between, so that a person can't say later on, you know what, I complained verbally on such and such a date. Well, there's not going to be any written record of the complaint if it's not down on paper. That is the only reason why. I think verbal, it just lends that, oh no, no one ever brought that to my attention, period.
So Douglas, do you understand the change that she's recommending?
I certainly do. I can, do a red line draft of this and return it.
We could, I mean, come up, I would think, to have a form that a person needs to fill in. So in other words, if they have to fill out a form and they have to sign it on such and such a day, I think it lends itself that more the person that's going to be putting the complaint in really has to think about exactly, like they have to sign saying that, what, this is what occurred. And this is, a record, there's a running record of it. Whereas if it's verbal, then it may be taken more as, what, we discussed it this day, but I mean, how do I know that this is, just complaining, or is this a real complaint?
No, and I understand what you're saying, Trustee, but again, so there's sort of two responses I have. The first is, okay, the specific language that you're referring to is discussing contact between two employees, the person doing the harassing and the person who is feeling harassed. The actual complaint itself does have to be in writing, and I'm certainly happy to clarify that language within the document for you, but I'm not going to include in the policy the actual complaint form that might be generated by HR or something like that, because that's sort of the procedure of how this policy will be implemented ultimately. This is sort of the guiding policy document.
Okay, so then in that line where it says, if there is sexual harassing behavior in the workplace, the harassed employee should directly and clearly express his objection to whoever, do you get it? To the supervisor, right,
well,
or
no,
whatever.
That's, yeah. If I can cut you off there, that's what the issue is that in order for you to make a finding of harassment occurring, the employee has to actually object and show that the behavior is unwanted in the first place. So what I'm saying is that objection can be verbal. So if you're, okay, come up to me and say something that I find offensive, I have to let you know that I find it offensive. Right. And the way that I can do that, what this policy is saying is that my saying to you, wait a minute, I'm not comfortable with that, that's offensive to me, is enough to make this harassment. If we were to change that objection to be required to be in writing, the employee would actually have to write to the other employee, I found your behavior on such and such a date, offensive, deliver it to that employee. But that doesn't go to the actual reporting or the process that the investigation would occur. This is just simply defining that a verbal objection to harassment is enough to create harassment.
Well, Douglas, so what you're saying is that the initial message can be verbal, but it doesn't have to be verbal. It could also be written.
It could be, yes, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, again,
I would encourage any employee to report any incidents of harassment to their manager.
Could we say the initial message may be verbal or written?
That's,
yes.
Isn't that?
This is Deb.
I'm sorry. Okay. Never mind.
This is Deb. I'm the HR manager.
Yes.
Make a comment.
Yes, please.
First of all, I'm very appreciative for the work that Douglas put into this document. It's very thorough and identifies almost every scenario. What I think Douglas is saying, if he told me something that was inappropriate and I didn't like it, I would tell Douglas, what you said offended me. And then I would write my supervisor a note that Douglas said something offensive to me. This is what he said. And I told him that I did not like it. Is that what you're saying, Douglas?
That is correct. Yes.
That is what I'm understanding too, but it seems like Martha's seeing it from a different perspective. So I'm trying to maybe clear it up somehow.
Yeah, I think I can modify it slightly, and I'll send a red line around before our board meeting.
Okay. And Deb, I was gonna ask you for your input next, but I don't know if you have more input.
I just had a couple of questions.
Okay.
As it's a policy, Douglas, and I may have overlooked it, is there anything in here regarding quid pro quo?
I don't know that I specifically use the phrase quid pro quo, but it certainly is included in the definition section.
It's not named, it doesn't call it specifically that, but it's in there. At least I read it to be.
I can define it to include that language if you would find that beneficial.
I would find it beneficial because it has been defined so often in the public by the Me Too movement. So as much clarity as we can provide, I suggest we do so.
Just for the record, it's in it's paragraph Roman numeral 4, section 1 and 2, where it says such conduct is made explicitly or implicitly a term of or condition of the individual's employment or the basis for employment decisions affecting the individual.
Right.
So either of those would be quid pro quo.
Okay. And I just have one other question. In our previous harassment policy, we had something in there regarding hostile work environment. So are we going to put hostile work environment into this one, or
it's in that same section? It's paragraph 3.
Oh,
or the creation of intimidation, hostile or offensive working environment. There is a comma missing in that section, however. So thank you for that.
No. And I believe those were the. Oh, I have one question. I'm sorry. And it's on the report where there's an indication a copy of the report will be given to the persons who made the initial report, the persons to whom the suspected harassment was directed, and the individuals accused of the harassment. Does that mean that the final report goes to the individual who made the initial harassing complaint?
Yes.
Does that not reveal the identification of everyone who was interviewed that could potentially lead to retaliation?
Well, I'm trying to walk sort of a fine line here, which is, one of the things that I've seen in some of the investigations that, the library has done is that the person who's made the complaint feels like their complaint wasn't taken seriously because they never saw that final report. By, providing that directly to the complainant, we really show that, we took their concern seriously, we investigated it, and here's what the final, sort of result of that is.
May I? Is it ever possible that final report that's given to the person that made it have the names redacted of witnesses or that kind of thing? Is that possible? And if so, who would do that?
Theoretically, that's possible. Part of the reason that I left it intentionally vague as to whether or not it would be a redacted or unredacted report was so that we can sort of internally take each case on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
Right? Because we do want to show everybody that we are going to be transparent, but transparency always sort of has that sort of, point where there are certain things that might have to be redacted out, or certain information, certain witnesses.
Is it okay if I interject here?
Go ahead.
So yeah, I agree that like with the transparency that I had this part ready, the report part that was brought up, because I do like that different individuals, all these different people that are involved are getting this report, because I do think it's important, whether it is witnesses or somebody saying, yeah, I heard this or I saw this, like it really fills the story. And obviously we want to make sure that people know that they're being heard, that they know that their story is being listened to and it's being taken serious. And so in this same note regarding this report, this might be more of an HR thing, maybe outside the purview of this, but when it comes to this report, I guess my question is, where does this report live? Like, what file does this live in? Because I know here it indicates that it indicates if there was harassment found, if it was not found, whatever the case might be. But where does this live? Does it live in a personnel file, or where does it go after that?
In the library, the investigation goes in its own investigatory file. If there's any action taken against any individual, such as discipline action, that is kept in the employee's file as a result of the investigation.
So is it only in the case that it's disciplinary?
That's the way it's been handled in the library for the past some odd years, unless you want to suggest it be stored elsewhere.
Well, I mean, I guess my thing is that, I mean, because like just looking at the newspaper article, for example, it indicates that there was no action taken against the individuals and that the complaints were instead kept in a separate file. And I guess that just struck me as odd that something like this would be just in a separate file away from personnel files. And so again, I don't know if that's common practice for other locations or places, but it just seems odd to me.
Douglas, do you know how they handle it at the city?
I mean, I believe that typically all reports are kept in the disciplinary files, but I would have to double check with them.
Right. I reached out to Tamika and I haven't gotten a response back yet because I still had a question about a copy of the report going to all persons named. I also believe in transparency, but I also get concerned with retaliation or misinterpretation of what people may be saying in the report. So I have not heard back from her with regard to how the city does their reporting.
Tatiana?
If I may, I agree with the transparency thing. I'm really, what Deb's saying is really serious, I think. I think if I were a witness and I came forward and I knew that my name would be in the report that both parties would get, especially if somebody's terminated or there's, a lawsuit or something, it would make me pause whether or not I would feel comfortable cooperating with any sort of investigation. So
I'll certainly take your comments under consideration and see if I can come up with some language about using redactions in the policy. But again, I think that a lot of times that can be handled on a case-by-case basis.
Brian?
I understand the retaliation concern that we're talking about, but I don't know. I think like just for myself, like on a moral level, if somebody was saying that they're being harassed, I mean, I myself, I don't know if I would feel like wary to help an investigation because you have somebody who's voicing a concern, and if you've seen something, then you should say something. And so I get the retaliation concern, but I don't know. To me, that's not as high priority, I think, as it is for others.
Well, typically, when you do a harassment report, it can be very thorough. The last one we did was about 13 pages, interviewing 13 employees. So without redaction, you could identify the name of the person you interviewed and perhaps the position they're in or the department that they work in. Because we're so familiar with one another, the complainant could reach out to that person interviewed and perhaps give that person a little bit of trouble. That was the only concern I had.
If I may, then, Douglas, I lean more towards what you were saying about just keeping it more vague, and then we would have, or HR would have the opportunity case by case to handle that or bring it up for discussion, or I don't know. Hector, what do you?
I agree with that. Like leaving it vague like it is now, because right, there might be those extreme cases where there is some personal information that can't be shared or something that needs to be redacted. But I think to make other employees feel welcome's not the right word to use, but to make them feel safe sharing their story or what they witnessed, I think leaving it vague and then treating it on a case-by-case basis would be probably the best way to handle that.
Okay. And then another scenario that could occur is once we give a copy to all involved, they could also share that copy with employees who weren't involved whatsoever. And that employee could then start to shun others. So there's a little bit of potential for retaliation that I know we would not want unless we reword that a little bit different, Douglas.
I mean, I'll certainly
Well,
take
and
your
once again, if I
concerns
may
under
interject
advisement.
here for a brief moment, if I may interject, I think a lot of the things we're talking about are procedural as much as they are policy. And in order to properly handle and mitigate privacy and so forth, those would all be things that we need to enforce. You know, the whistle, if somebody decided to complain about someone, we wouldn't advertise their name, and it would be kept explicitly clear that anyone who has any input, this is confidential and it's not supposed to be shared. So then that's a whole other different discussion, whether they violate that rule. So I just wanted to point that out, that a lot of this is largely procedural.
Well, and to John's point, and to echo what he was just saying, I mean, what I was going to respond with was pointing out that we very strictly prohibit retaliation under this policy, going so far as to point out the statutory protections available to somebody who is retaliated against, including witnesses, anybody who's been disclosed or threatened on, as a result of their assisting the investigations.
Okay. Are those all the questions and comments you will have?
I have one more question or one more comment. The person going to the person that's harassing them, you know, each person takes it a different way. I know when I was a high schooler and I was being sexually harassed, I ended up just leaving the position because I didn't speak to the person because at that time I felt intimidated by the person. He was a supervisor, and I told my parents about it, and they were like, you know what, he was doing this to other people, and I just left the position instead. So based on the person is there would be their decision of going to the person that's harassing them. So you may have this continuing just because the person is afraid to discuss it with the person. But I really, really would like to see a form that a person would fill out instead of talking to the person, that the person would give to the supervisor. In other words, everyone would fill out the same form where they're signing, you know, because then that also holds them that if they are lying about it, you know, then at least you have something on paper where it says that, if this is not true, you know, that I know that, there's repercussions for the person that's accusing too. You know what I mean? For them to think more about it. That's the only reason why.
To clarify, Martha, you just mean that an actual physical signature on something? Douglas,
Right.
is that possible, even if it's just part of whatever complaint that gets taken to management or supervisors, there is some incorporation of a signature?
There's a running record, something down on paper.
I mean, again, I want to sort of differentiate the two things that I'm hearing the trustee talk about. You know, the first is, you know, with regard to, you know, the fear aspect and the interaction between the employees, you know, there is a difficulty with the way the law operates in that you have to, you know, the other person has to be aware that the action that they're taking is unwelcome. And the only way that we can really get over that hurdle is by somebody stepping up and saying, you know, that's inappropriate. With regards to the complaints, you know, that's where we get into what John was talking about a couple of minutes ago about, you know, we can certainly flesh out what the reporting documents actually look like, and we certainly will incorporate something like a signature line. And there certainly is language in here that talks about the consequences for making a knowingly false report. So, we are taking this all very seriously.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Douglas and Martha. I had a comment. On the second page, we used gendered pronouns, her and his, and herself and himself. Could we make those non-gendered pronouns like they are in the rest of the
Yes.
document?
I apologize if I missed a couple of those. I thought that I had caught when I had taken parts of this document from the draft that I had showed you earlier.
Okay.
There was gendered language, and I tried to catch most of those, but I noticed you're right.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions? Nope. So we're not voting on this to push it to the board, right? It was just a discussion of the draft.
I mean, you can push it to the board if.
This was the only action item that we had to push officially to the board, and so you can make a motion to approve with Douglas's changes, the requested changes.
So I'll
and
make a motion.
Final approval.
I'll make a motion to approve and send to the full board the sexual harassment prohibition policy with the recommended changes from today's governance committee meeting.
I'll second it.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Bye.
Okay, any opposed? None. So we'll have this on the agenda for the next Board of Trustees meeting. All right, next on the agenda is discussion and status of alcohol and drug-free workplace policy 360.
And if I may, I would like to defer to Douglas to explain our hesitancy to jump to do this policy right away. It requires review, and I would like Douglas to give you the explanation. He may explain it very well in an email, but I want to just give him an opportunity to say so.
Go ahead, Douglas. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, like John said, I took a look at this policy. I do have concerns with some of the language. I think that there's some pretty substantial vagaries in it that make it, really unenforceable as provided. I also have concerns about specifically including language regarding the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act at this stage. I know that I've privately shared with a couple of you, some of those concerns. I don't really want to be the test case on this. I think that we can craft, and I can certainly use this as a draft document to craft a better drug and alcohol free workplace policy for the library. But I do have some pretty substantial concerns with some of these sections.
And what do you think would be the process moving forward? Are we going to have a new draft written by you for next month, or?
I could certainly have a draft due in a matter of days or weeks. Yes.
Who wrote this draft? What's the origin of this draft that we read?
This is Deb. This document was downloaded from the HR Source website from training that was provided when marijuana became legal on January 1. It was written by Jim Griffin, who is an attorney for HR Source. I download it.
Okay.
And we discussed this policy at a previous governance committee meeting. Believe it was the last one we held, and we held it over because Douglas had some feedback that he wanted to discuss. So we'll just have a new one at the next meeting, Douglas?
Yeah, I'll absolutely try to have it too, and within probably about a week.
Okay.
So we won't be bringing this to the full board then? We'll just wait till the next governance? Okay. Correct. All right, so we'll move on to the discussion of emergency fine and fee removal due to COVID-19. And we all got a copy of our current fines and fees policy 420.
I would like to propose consideration of elimination of fines and fees. This is something that we've been talking about, and the library took a step to do away with fines and fees early on, 2016 or 17. the eventuality was that we would do the same for DVDs and video games. And at this point, that was where we were headed with this. That's why it was on the January agenda to start the governance committee and thinking about eliminating fines and fees altogether. Now, to add to that, right now in the midst of COVID, there are several policies that are restrictive to use of the public library. We, as many institutions in this great country, are punitive in our nature. And libraries, since the beginning of libraries, have charged fines and fees, right? And they vary between the cost of the item to sometimes replacement of items. But ultimately, they are punitive. We are punishing people who have no money and have no ability to pay, and perhaps could benefit from having access to the library. So I just want to urge you to look at the two items in this policy that really concern me. Is the $1 a day on a specific item that penalizes people who use those items. Initially, when libraries started buying videos, they cost $100 a piece, and I can understand that's why video stores charged, because those VHSs, when libraries started circulating VHSs, cost $139 a piece. But prices have driven down, and oftentimes our DVDs are less expensive than our books, anywhere between $10 and $15, sometimes 20 or 30 for a DVD for a special edition. But a book, hardback, is $35, and we don't charge anyone $1 a day when they don't bring the book back on time. So that being said, and we're in the midst of COVID, there is also a $10 fine threshold built into this fines and fees policy, referenced in several other policies, including our internet access policy, as well as our library cards policy, thus making it restrictive for people to be able to have a library card or use their electronic resources as an example, because of that $10 fine threshold. And I just wanted to put those 2 points out there in terms, as Douglas mentioned, we could move this policy to the whole board at the next meeting and make a decision to make that move now. But I would like to work on a greater omnibus policy that reflects all of our different policies impacted by COVID, including personnel and other policies that are definitely going to need some looking at. But I'd like the whole leadership team to take a look at those policies with their perspective and their departments, not for mine.
I would like to move forward with this to for the next meeting to eliminate fines, not fees. Could we get those changes made to this policy, and then we'll approve that today and move it to the full board so that would essentially eliminate all fines. And I think we need to explain, I know there's some new people on here that maybe didn't get the full explanation of the difference between fines and fees, whereas fines are, if you return something late, you accumulate charges, which are the fines, correct? And the fees you accumulate if you didn't return an item or you damaged it.
May I
That is
talk
correct
about this? Because I know this has been a big issue for me at least in the previous meeting we had. I guess what I'm interested in is seeing something like the fines to me are incentive to hurry back and bring an item back, or to immediately disclose if it's been lost or damaged. And I understand that it's prohibitive, but if I can't afford my $10 fine, how would I afford the replacement of the item? So that's one part that I feel. Secondly, I feel like things like video games and DVDs are different. And I guess I just am interested in more information on retention of these things. And if there's no incentive for me to return it, I guess I'm worried about removing the incentive for me to return the item is my only hesitation. But I realize with COVID, I understand that whole element, so.
John, at one point I received a summary of how many items we had out there that had not been returned, items that have been damaged, how much we are owed in fines and fees. Is it possible to get that to all trustees?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, John.
And I think the big telling issue here, and I'll stand on top of my soapbox one more time, the amount of items that people don't return back because they're afraid of accruing a $10 fee for having a DVD out for 10 days, and then they have to pay for it, or somebody goes out of town. There's so many possibilities in terms of this policy. And I would dare say that the amount of things that people don't return out of fear of reprisal is greater than the things that we would charge people for. If they damage the goods, of course, they put something that's the public property, they need to replace it. But fines and fees are also considered very punitive in terms of, you can't.
Could we
follow
think
society's
outside
rules.
of the box a little bit and possibly do something like maybe it's not $1 a day for a DVD fine, like some sort of discussion of different fines, if you will, and maybe those fines could be paid in a canned food item. So if you don't have that, and then that goes into the local Waukegan food pantries, some sort of partnership that way, so that there is some sort of incentive, and a can of food or a noodle pack of ramen gets brought in with that DVD, something like that.
Absolutely. And that's part of the policy. We do give those as allowances for people to participate. And that's one thing I'd like to see us do.
Yeah, I actually had a question about that because I know on this document it does indicate that there are those like special promotions, and I guess my question was, how often are those things done already? Because I think that's a great idea. Obviously, doing like a canned food drive instead of like the fees, having them do that type of thing instead.
They're very seldom had, and you can do a lot of neat things with it. One can for $2 worth of fines, or $1 donation to your favorite charity for $2 worth of fines removed. It's definitely worth it to look into.
Yeah, because as soon as I read that, I remembered when I was in undergrad at Loyola that's how their library did it. So at the end of the semester, pretty much every student on campus is bringing cans in because they have books from that library, other libraries, and it's just a good way to, not nickel and dime, but still promote, getting stuff back on time.
I don't think we should promote like the certain dates that we have that promotion, because then you're just like, you're gonna accumulate fees, and then that day just pay them off, knowing that it's gonna happen, right? Then we're in.
Could it be an ongoing thing though? That instead of I don't know. I just am hesitant to just eliminate it all. Especially considering it's video games and DVDs that we're talking about. So I don't know. I still think like it taught myself and my family a great deal about responsibilities, it's been a good lesson to teach to, these are our things that we're borrowing them, and a good lesson on how to care for them and take care of them and to return them promptly for other people. So I realize that I'm, kind of old school on this and outdated, and I'm open to a discussion about it and learning more about it as we go. So just even thinking about other options.
Yeah, I understand your point, Tatiana. I would be okay with that for the fees, but I think fines we should just eliminate totally. Because if you return your item undamaged, and in good condition for the next person to use, and we can eliminate your fine. You brought it back.
But why would I return it?
Well, at that point, you would get charged a fee if you don't return it.
Right, but I would have so much longer, right? So when does it, like, if I took out a DVD, how many days until I have that fee?
It varies. Some of them are 3 days, some of them are 7 days. They're different lengths of checkout. But this is definitely a procedural thing that we can discuss. And Josue, I would be happy to explain, and we can set. Why I wanted to mention it and have discussion, but not necessarily make a decision.
Sure, absolutely.
I want to ask a question.
Go ahead, Martha, but we could barely hear you.
All right, okay. Now do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is that I would feel sorry for the poor librarians or your reference desk, because if I'm going to put something on reserve for another client, and I'm never going to know if it's going to come in, because if there's no fines or fees or whatever, then what is my incentive to bring it back on time? And then I'm going to be waiting for a poor customer that wants that same book or that same DVD. I think just not having any repercussions would just open up a big can of worms of no one bringing anything back. Sorry.
Well, Martha, we already don't have fines for books. This is only for adult feature DVDs.
Right.
So, I mean, that issue have we seen that issue with books, John? There are no fines?
No, there's people are bringing things back. Sometimes we have to track people down, but there is that social capital that everybody understands their materials belong to the library. And we just want the materials back. That's the most important thing, not to have them not bring them back because they're afraid they're going to never be able to use their library card again.
So
Okay.
in some way, we've already tested this with every other item except the DVDs. And do you think that we would get the same result if we remove fines, that people aren't gonna, just keep the DVD?
May I say something, please?
Go ahead.
So I think it's not one without the other. I think that if we say we're going to remove something, we also have to help the community understand why we're removing it and what the benefit is to them. So we're really trying to create a trusting relationship, whereas you borrow something, our trust and expectation is you're going to bring it back. So it has to kind of go hand in hand with coaching and mentorship. A lot of people that are coming in and out of the library are, as I like to say, frequent flyers. And so the staff will know in some cases people have things out. It's do some gentle reminders. Hey, did you bring back such and such yet, or whatever we're looking for? It's about we don't have a lot and we want to give you what we have, but we also want to share what we have as a library with the rest of the community. So I think these are teaching moments. I love what John was saying about moving away from punitive. And to be honest with you, punitive has never worked. We've never collected what we were actually owed, right? Because nobody has the money to pay that. So because I was here then, when we were talking about stopping it, it wasn't that much of a loss in revenue. Don't get me wrong, every dollar is important, but it wasn't, like huge because we weren't collecting the money anyway. And so if we say there's none, there has to be sort of a campaign and a talk for 2 months or 3 months before you say there's no fines to set the expectation. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good perspective. I really want trustees to see the summary of how many people we have blocked out in the library because they owe more. Thousands of those are youth, and then obviously the vast majority are adults because they're the ones that check out probably the DVDs. And I think over it's a lot of money. I saw on the sheet. I don't know how much it was. It was over $100,000.
Oh, but the original or one of the numbers that you saw was also the fees from the beginning of time. Okay. There's one report that it's cumulative. It's not an annualized report.
Okay.
And so I think, again, at the end of the day, how do you balance the thought of money that won't be collected versus people who never make the effort to come in and borrow? And so we hear that. We hear, in our classes and in our tutoring, you can take this book out and whatever. No, I don't want to get a fine. I'm afraid I'm going to get a fine. So we have people that don't use us for fear of getting a fine. So again, I just caution us to sort of have a balance.
Yeah, I agree. And that's the fear that I want to get rid of because, at the end of the day, if you check out a DVD and you happen to bring it back late, you accumulated these fines and say you do that 10 times, you're now banned from using or checking out other materials from the library. And if you're a young kid, who's going to school and wants these materials, you can't because you can't pay the $10. So that my perspective is you accumulate these fines because it's late, but then you turned it back in. Other people can use it. It's in good condition. Why can we not forgive that fine?
If I may also put in just a plug for this is strictly also an operational decision because at the end of the day, we are going to field so many calls of people. We have fielded plenty of calls from patrons who are at that $10 or above threshold. And we said, well, give us a call and we'll work it out. So we're making exception upon exception and we can do that, but that's very labor intensive. And to call people and remedy and rectify their accounts we have 14,000 library cards active, I believe.
So is there some sort of middle ground that we can reach that is
absolutely,
raise that from $10 to $20 and lower the fines on DVDs that they're not $1, but they're 10 cents, 15 cents, 25 cents. Me personally, I'm hesitant to completely strip it away. But
and my question to you,
the full board discussion.
My question to you would be why have that low of a fine on a DVD? If we don't have any fines on books, why have that low of a fine on DVD? It's not going to make up any money for much of it.
I guess I just feel like the DVDs go faster. So, and this is purely speculative because it's just me being in the library and me seeing a lot of people at the DVDs and video games and a lot of kids at the DVDs and video games. And I just worry about them not coming back. I guess, I don't know. And like what Martha was saying, like if there's nothing and I can let it rack up to like the full cost of the item, that's still going to put me maybe in a worse spot that I didn't have that $10 to pay, but now I have to pay, 15, 20 plus dollars. So maybe I just don't bring that item back and I just say, fine, like I'm just not going to bring it back because I just don't have that money.
But at that point, you owe fees. And I had the same concerns. I asked, like, okay, so we get rid of fines, or what's the stats show that are people just not going to bring anything back? And when I initially brought this up in January, I was provided with research. I don't have it here, but I'll try to share if I find it, that this didn't increase the amount of items that were lost or never brought back.
So somebody did share some research with me, because when I know I was vocal when this first got brought up last year. I was pretty vocal, and I know that a couple people did share research. The libraries that we're sharing research from were from, like, it wasn't Schaumburg, but they were different type communities. They were.
If I may clarify, I believe the Chicago Public Library, they recently went completely fine-free, and I believe that's when we discussed it last in the board meeting.
Okay.
So I understand your concerns, Tatiana, but I think based on recommendations from staff in the past, there's a bigger benefit to increase access than to have a punitive fine for things like this. I think fees should still be there. If you destroy something or lose it, yeah, you owe us money for it. And then if you owe us and then can't pay us that, I think that's where the canned food drives come in, or other ways of making up for that.
Yeah, and I think that goes to what I believe Gail was saying about, obviously, if it's less punitive, then it makes it a more welcoming environment. And I think that if we already have the fines gone for other things, it should just be consistent across the board, because then you're adding, just more complications in terms of people they might not even realize, like, that there's no fines for books. They see it for a DVD, maybe they frequently get video games, but now they think that there might be fines for the books that they now have. And so I think if it's, all fines in this scenario are gone, it just makes it clear across the board that there are no fines. And again, like Josue was saying earlier, the difference between fines and fees, we're talking about fines being eliminated. I think that getting rid of it, and especially hearing that that's what the staff is saying should be done, then that's what I would think should be done as well.
And I wouldn't be surprised if these fines are disproportionately affecting low-income people. Because if you make money and you got a fine, of course you're just gonna pay it. $10 if you make $100,000 is nothing. But say you're a family of 4 and you make $30,000, that $10 versus buying $10 in gas or food is probably a bigger difference. And so I see it as a way, we don't want our items to go missing, but I'm pretty sure that we're disproportionately affecting low-income people in our community by doing this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think any barrier like this, I think about, just for example, just hypothetical, right? Like, say a family has 3 kids and they all have to go on a field trip, but they don't make a lot of money. They have to decide, right, which kid's going to get to go. And that's just setting up another monetary barrier. And something like this, like, I get why you have fines, things like that. But when we're talking about the public library, going back to what somebody else was saying, like the social aspect of it, like, you check something out and you should just know, right, it's not yours and you should return it. And there obviously are cases where people just don't bring it back. But then I think that falls into fees where things are then lost. But that's a different part of this.
Yeah, and I just want to make note that I've been doing a lot of research on this, because I had the same concerns at first. I don't want our library to be empty because people didn't return items. But the research shows that didn't end up happening at other libraries. And instead, fines are seen as a social inequity. We're just stopping people from using the services because they couldn't return something on time. I believe the American Library Association recently, somehow, I think they passed a resolution or declared it that fines are a social inequity or a barrier to using libraries, and they recommended that we get rid of fines. And so that's where I'm seeing it from, more on an equity basis, and not, I mean, especially banning youth from using our services. I think we're here to promote learning, but yet because you owe us $10, we're not going to let you check stuff out and take it home.
Mhm.
John, do you have a recommendation how we can move forward with this policy and changes?
Well, I wanted to mention that Sylvia has mentioned a few things in the chat. One of the things that she mentioned was, can the library send out letters to remind them of the reason why libraries exist, to share the items or what's in place now? And I guess, yes, I can make changes to this policy. But as I said before, I mean, it's really just a matter of, we can either raise the threshold to more than $10, but that just means we're going to have to make those adjustments for the $20 threshold. And we'll just it's just perpetuating the problem rather than addressing the root and cutting it off at the root.
If I could make the recommendation, and with the approval of the rest of this committee, to recommend to the full Board of Trustees the removal of all fines from this policy, and then have that policy in place for the next Board of Trustees meeting for a vote and discussion and a vote. Is that possible?
Well, and honestly, that policy that you have in front of you could be just modified to eliminate the line about fines and fees. So those changes can be made, and that could be presented as a draft to the whole board.
So I'll make a motion to recommend to the full Board of Trustees policy regarding fines and fees 420 without with the removal of fines in the entire policy.
I'll second that.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Opposed?
Aye.
None. Okay, so we'll recommend to the full Board of Trustees, in summary, the removal of all fines. And fees will stay the same unless someone on the board has a recommendation for that. That's it on the agenda for today's governance committee, unless someone has any comments about something they want to see at the next meeting, or any questions while we have all these people on the call.
Yes, would you consider in the future, would the library consider having maybe like a movie or something in the parking lot for patrons?
Absolutely. Feel free to reach out to me, Martha. My number was attached to the last email I sent to the group. So please shoot me a message and we'll see what we can do. One of the things we'd like to talk about doing is a concert sometime over Fiestas Patrias in the month of Hispanic Heritage Month, from September 16th to October 15th. A drive-in concert is one of the things we've discussed with the mariachi band.
Sounds like a good idea. Anyone else? All right, so I'll motion to adjourn the meeting at 6:30 p.m., exactly an hour. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. We'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice night.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Take good care.
Good night.